Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out on this lovely spring day. If we could record and have microphones outside, we probably should do it outside. But I understand we have a fabulous PowerPoint coming, so we wouldn't want to miss that. So welcome to this, which is our second and final annual of 2 comparative theological lectures here at the Center for the Study of World Religions. It's both a true honor and a genuine pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon's distinguished speaker, who's hanging out in the back, which I hope he won't keep doing, Wesley Wildman, who's professor of philosophy, theology, and ethics across the river at Boston University. He is also the founding director of the Institute for the Biocultural Study of Religion, which I'm sure a number of you in the audience are very familiar with their work. Educated first in Australia, then at the Graduate Theological Union, Professor Wildman first joined the BU faculty in 1993. I know that his work, particularly in pioneering new directions in the study of science and religion, is already well known to and much appreciated by many of you here in the audience. His publications are simply far, far too numerous to mention in full, but among his monographs that I know are oft read and studied and discussed here, among the many listed, that long list includes Science and Religious Anthropology, a spiritually evocative naturalist interpretation of human life, published by Ashgate in 2009. Religious Philosophy is Multidisciplinary Comparative Inquiry, Envisioning a Future for the Philosophy of Religion, published by State University of New York Press in 2010, and Religious and Spiritual Experiences, published by Cambridge in 2011. Professor Wildman also leads the way institutionally in multiple ways to further the science and religion discussion. In addition to founding the Institute for the Biocultural Study of Religion in 2007, with Richard Sosis and Patrick McNamara, he's the founding co-editor of the journal well known here of Religion, Brain, and Behavior, and is also a founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion. I'm particularly grateful for Professor Wildman, who thought he was going to be in Boston anyway, but ended up coming from his year sabbatical in Princeton, just for us. So his talk today, as you can see, is entitled Comparative Natural Theology. So please join me in welcoming Professor Wesley Wildman.
Greetings. It's lovely to be here. Very nice to see you all this evening. Comparative natural theology has something to do with natural theology. And natural theology has got something to do with inference. Inference has something to do with arrows. That's the theme. That's a beautiful photograph of naturally coloured autumn leaves arranged in an arrow. In traditional natural theology, the arrow of inference from the world to ultimate reality is treated as if it were very simple, straight, clean. In my view, it's incredibly complex, and it looks a lot more like that. And part of the fun of comparative theology, doing it properly, I think, is to dig into the details and see how inference actually works. It's quite surprising when you do the analysis. Now, I'm a philosopher and a theologian, and I've done quite a bit of comparative theology, but I am still a philosopher, and you don't normally hear from philosophers here, I understand. So you will actually see some logical analysis in this lecture.
Lead us through it step by step. Yeah.
So if that's unexpected, then it's probably good for you.
You have vaccines against philosophers.
So, I'm going to put some glasses on so that I can read the text from time to time here. So, traditional natural theology, as I'm going to be defining it here, aims at direct entailment from the world to God. More precisely, it aims to infer a partial metaphysics of ultimacy from a partial ontology of nature. I'm going to have to get into that to see exactly what that looks like. What I think we need is a way between two famous extremes. One of them looks like this. Traditional supporters of natural theology think you can argue from the world to God, but when you slow down and ask what they really mean, they're not talking about the whole world, they're talking about the little bit of it that they theorise. That's the partial ontology of nature. And they're not talking about God as such or every aspect of ultimate reality. They're talking about a partial metaphysics of ultimacy. And the inferential structure that they care about is expressed in that red arrow. People who think you can do this say that there's a real red arrow there that works for inference, and detractors say, no way, Jose, there's nothing happening there. You just can't get from a partial ontology of nature to a partial metaphysics of ultimacy. The position I want to defend is in between these two extremes. It's that you can actually pull it off, but it's very complicated. It's ambiguous, and you have a very vague inferential terrain to navigate if you're going to try and do natural theology at all. I think that's the realistic alternative. The conceptual traction that you can expect between a partial ontology of nature and a partial metaphysics of ultimacy is so vague that it might only give you leverage on choosing among competing theories, helping you decide which of them is more plausible, rather than giving you a definitive proof of anything. So that's what I think the situation is. That's if you like, a simple introduction to where we'll be headed, and I'll recap that at the end to make sure that we got the main point. A lot of people would say maybe it's so complicated that you shouldn't bother in the first place, but I think the real payoff is that you really can get inferential traction. You really can constrain competing theories of ultimate reality and ultimacy using information that comes from philosophical interpretations of nature as guided by the sciences. Again, you don't get proofs. I'm a pragmatist in philosophical orientation, so I'm a fallibilist anyway. I'm not ruling out proofs just on that epistemological ground, but also because of the complexity of the situation just in the nature of the case, and it's that complexity that we're going to be diving into. So if I'm right about this, traditional natural theology is impossible. Outright scepticism towards natural theology is needlessly defeatist, and that we need a different approach to navigating the conceptual and logical linkages between ontology of nature and a metaphysics of ultimacy. This different approach wouldn't aim at watertight proof, but at evaluating large-scale systems of ideas for their plausibility in relation to every relevant consideration. It would have to be comparative in character, because you've got to work across competing theories to do this. This is the basis for calling this new approach comparative natural theology. So comparative natural theology has a special virtue of overcoming a lamentable pattern of bias that's painfully obvious as soon as the religious philosopher reaches beyond a single tradition to consider the stars of argument in other traditions. I don't know whether you've noticed this bias. It's not that difficult to see, but you can see people doing natural theology who speak as if it were really obvious what ultimate reality is, but that's heavily contested across religious traditions, and the fact that natural theology in its traditional forms doesn't properly register that is a serious weakness, a fatal flaw perhaps. So we need to sort out a couple of terms just to make sure that we're on the same track here. First of all, what do I mean by ultimacy models being relatively more or less plausible in different respects? Remember, this is what I think that comparative natural theology can do. It can shift relative plausibility across competing theories. Well, I think ultimacy theories might be like herbs and spices. It's really crazy to say that there's a best one. What you really need is best for what? You need respects of comparison. And once you've figured out what respects of comparison are relevant at any given moment, then you can evaluate those theories in those respects. And it could easily be the case that ultimacy theories are like herbs and spices in that way. I think that's probably correct. All right, a couple of terms. What is an ontology of nature? This is what's on the left-hand side of the big arrow. That's a philosophical interpretation of nature. If you've studied science, you'll know that science tends to be very precise and particular, and you really can't get anything philosophically going using science until you put it in a philosophical framework. So the ontology of nature is a philosophical interpretation of nature that's aided by science. It's still a philosophical object. Ultimacy, it's a vague comparative category the way we use it, informed by the Comparative Religious Ideas project that Frank Clooney was involved in some years ago. The 3 volumes of that project, published in 2001, introduced the idea of vague comparative categories as ways of formalising what it is that we're doing when we compare. You're setting up a category, say ultimate reality or the human condition, something, food, that can be specified differently in different social, historical, cultural, religious contexts. As such, the category, being vague, is capable of sustaining contradictory specifications. Right? I mean, some people's idea of ultimate reality includes a personal divine being. Other people's definitely does not, and yet are both understandings of ultimate reality. So it's vague in the technical, logical sense that it can tolerate possibly contradictory specifications. This is how ultimacy is used. The second volume of the CRIP project, Comparative Religious Ideas, acronym is CRIP, was called Ultimates, and in that, Ultimate Realities, in that the book lays out the argument for the least distorting category for talking about ultimate reality being ultimate realities, not God, not Shunyata, not Nirguna Brahman, but ultimate realities more generally. And this particular category then can be generalised still further by noticing that in some traditions it's not ultimate reality that's interesting at all. It's ultimate paths or ultimate ways. So how do you construct a category for comparison that comprehends both ultimate paths and ultimate realities? Well, ultimacy is such a category. So it's just a name by itself, but when you take a name like that, put it into the type of social context where you're constantly correcting hypotheses that you make for the purposes of comparing, you've got a vague comparative category that's useful for the process of comparative theology. So finally, natural theology. Quite often natural theology is contrasted with revealed theology, and in certain traditions you really don't speak about natural theology unless you have in mind that there's a revelation as well. Why would you do that? Well, it's pretty natural actually. If you try and do comparative theology in any of the traditions, South Asian or West Asian particularly, what you find is that you get maybe an inference that there's some creator or some ontological source for things, but you don't know a lot about its character. So how do you find out about its character? Well, that's what revelation's for. So there's this tag teaming between revealed theology and natural theology that's understood in a lot of these traditions. But in the sense in which I'm using natural theology, it's not necessary that there be anything called revealed theology. As a mystical theologian myself, I'd be inclined to think that there's no difference between nature and revelation. So I would reject the distinction between revealed theology and natural theology. But you don't have to agree with me either. The point at the moment is just, I don't need the contrast with revealed theology to make natural theology work in the sense in which I mean it here. All right, let's think about some challenges facing natural theology. I think there are 4 of them. The first is that the ontology of nature is complicated. It's an intellectual creation to begin with, and a complicated one. It synthesises a great deal of scientific theorising about nature, crystallises principles by which to make sense of rational structures in nature. That's made difficult by the enormity of the task, but also by the fact that the natural sciences themselves are an uneven and sometimes ad hoc patchwork of theories about nature, not a seamless garment of rational comprehensiveness. Anyone who knows any history of science or philosophy of science knows that. So realising this makes the proofs of traditional natural theology seem oversimplified, if not naive. For example, the sciences employ several apparently incompatible concepts of causation, and philosophy of science has struggled more or less in vain to clarify the concept of causation. Well, cosmological proofs that rely on causation then appear to be building on a foundation of sand. Because of its orientation to weighing the plausibility of large-scale systems of ideas, comparative natural theology is much better able to manage the vagueness and complexity and intricacy surrounding ontologies of nature. Second, if you're working on a comparative competition, think of it as a dance competition. You've got one dancer over here who's representing one theory of ultimate reality and another dancer over here representing another. You might be able to decide between those two dancers, but how do you know there's not a better dancer somewhere? That's an important question, isn't it? So one of the great problems is that ultimacy hypotheses in traditional natural theology are frequently just missing. Really obvious and important ones are just not included in the discussion. I'll give you an example of that later on. A third problem is that comparative evaluation of the plausibility of large-scale conceptual frameworks is relatively new as an explicit form of inquiry. It's got ancient antecedents in all literate cultures, but traditional natural theology has tended to ignore the challenge of large-scale worldview evaluation. Well, sort of ignore it. It does it, only it does it secretly, surreptitiously. Basically, it silently invokes a premise that excludes, say, any emptiness theory of ultimacy, or that just excludes a featureless divinity of the Nirguna Brahman kind. It's not that it's explicitly engaged, discussed and debated the way it is in the traditions that support those ideas. They're just sort of elided from the conversation. Then there's the fact that people invoke comparative criteria. You could formalise the fact that you exclude that idea. Let's say you hated personal theism and you wanted to talk about ultimate reality, and so you invoke a comparative criterion that excludes the thing you don't like. Well, you just need to set it up right to be able to exclude personal theism. It's not that difficult. For example, personal theism never really gives a great answer to the problem of the one and the many, because the one God has, if it's personal, then it's got an awful lot of determinate features. It just doesn't seem like the ultimate answer to the problem of life, the universe and everything if it's got all these determinate features that are not explained. So you invoke this comparative criterion that says you have to solve the problem of the one and the many, and if you don't, you're not worthy of entering the dance competition. Now, most people, like I say, are doing this silently, but you can formalise it and state the principle that's silently being surreptitiously used to exclude competitors. And that's a part of what it means, I think, to make comparative theology, comparative natural theology, more just, right? Actually getting brilliant ideas into the conversation. Well, there may not be a single superior theory of ultimacy. That's another big problem. And traditional natural theology hasn't really been open to that as a possibility, but I think we need to be. Now, those difficulties don't constitute a knockdown argument against the possibility of natural theology, not even traditional natural theology, but they do define the senses in which it's difficult, and they also indicate why comparative natural theology is going to be better than traditional natural theology at managing those difficulties. Most profoundly, they suggest that traditional natural theology is in fact an intellectually short-circuited and over-ambitious simplification of comparative natural theology. So they're just doing comparative natural theology badly. Right? That's the way I like to set it up. Now, you might think that's horribly unfair, but an argument might actually support my point. Wouldn't that be good? What are the prospects for traditional natural theology? I've just argued that the prospects for natural theology cannot be definitively evaluated in the abstract, notwithstanding numerous attempts to do so. It's just going to be very complicated. Those four problems are going to make it really, really difficult to say whether you're going to be able to pull this off or not, this enterprise of making the inferential arrow from the world to God work. Whether natural theology is possible has to be established or refuted through attempts to do it. And then the chances of success turn decisively on how effectively philosophical interpretations of nature constrain ultimacy. So we're face to face with the deepest problem in all natural theology. Can nature tell us anything about ultimacy? It's an ancient question. It's shared across cultures. It's handed differently but in structurally relatable ways in West Asian, South Asian, East Asian philosophical traditions. More often than not, the answer has been a qualified yes. Yeah, the world tells us something about ultimacy, but not as much as we really want to know. For example, the cosmological arguments of medieval Judaism, Christianity and Islam concurred that there must be an ultimate reality that gives rise to the proximate reality that we know, but we can't infer much about its character, certainly not as much as you get from reading the sacred texts of those traditions. Similarly, many traditions of South Asian philosophy found it necessary to include authority as one of the valid forms of inference, one of the pramanyas, because observation and logic alone could not yield the Vedic portrayal of ultimacy. Chinese traditions perhaps have been the most optimistic about reading the character of ultimacy off of the way reality shows up for us in natural processes, but look what they produced. Very often a plural and vague vision of ultimacy. Plural, vague, right? Which confirms the difficulty of the task as I'm trying to describe it. Excuse me. Alright, so everyone's doing it, trying to navigate the inferential journey from nature to ultimacy. There are some specialised subplots that are worthwhile looking at. One is skepticism. That is a dog eating homework. Sometimes it happens. But you'd be right to be sceptical. On the sceptical side, for example, Buddhist philosophy relies heavily on the possibility of inference from human experience to religious insight, but the fruit of this inference, even in some of the most philosophically rigorous schools, such as Madhyamaka, is primarily a spiritually liberating path, and only secondary, only vaguely a metaphysical portrayal of ultimacy. You know, the fire sermon, right? If there's a fire in the house, what do? You get out. Right? Do you pause to examine the wallpaper on the way out? No. That's what trying to figure out ultimate reality is in that Buddhist framework, right? So that's the skeptical version of Buddhism. You've got other versions as well. Theistic traditions also have skeptical versions. For example, exclusive reliance on God's self-revelation, conjoined with the denial that we can infer anything about God from created reality. Swiss theologian Karl Barth, anyone? Right? That was Karl Barth's way of thinking about things. But the counterintuitive result of these sceptical views is that there are no natural or scientific constraints whatsoever on revealed traditions' claims about God. Could the loving God that Karl Barth believed in really create a world that was utterly misleading as a source of knowledge about God? That's not intuitive either, is it? You'd expect that a loving God wouldn't create something that was completely useless for inference to God's nature. In principle, though, Barth ruled that out. Now, the extremely optimistic side is rare by comparison. These are rose-tinted glasses, in case you're wondering. Some thinkers have claimed that the pattern of inference from apparent design in cosmology and biology to a designer can produce detailed knowledge of the character and purposes of ultimacy, as well as knowledge of the designer's existence and relation to the world. That's a lot to know. These natural theology enthusiasts sometimes even reject revealed theology altogether as too burdened with myth to make a useful contribution to knowledge about ultimacy. 20th century American philosopher Charles Hartshorne is an example of one kind. Early 19th century German philosopher Georg Hegel is an example of another. Enlightenment deism in its many, many forms, including all the way down to the present in people like Paul Davies, a science religion person, is a third type of example. In our time, most everyone's in this middle ground between the extremely sceptical and the extremely optimistic rose-tinted glasses view. That's where most people working in religion and science inhabit, that middle territory. Most accept that nature constrains what we can say about ultimacy, and they do this while admitting that nature does not permit clear lines of entailment from science to detailed knowledge of ultimacy, while tolerating a persistent lack of clarity about what precisely these constraints are. So if you try and tie one of them down, say what you mean, it's really frustrating, I have found. Within these boundaries, there are several debated questions. Here's two of them. One question is, are the constraints from science on hypotheses about ultimacy strict enough to allow direct entailment relations from science to a single ultimate reality that might be worthy of the name God? This gorgeous photograph expresses that. You know, we're working in this vague, complex territory. Can we actually see looming from the mist a single ultimate reality that would be worthy of the name God? So intelligent design theorists like Michael Behe or the mathematician-philosopher William Dembski say yes, though they admit consistently with the medieval design arguments that the entailment doesn't yield much more than the sheer existence of a designer. Technically speaking, it might be clever aliens. That's allowed. Atheists say yes too, but it's the non-existence of the giraffe / divine being that science supposedly entails. Numerous contemporary sceptical authors, from Carl Sagan to Michael Shermer, stop just short of evidence-based atheism when they say that science is steadily removing any need we once might have had to postulate God. Most in the science-religion dialogue suspect that science is too vague to determine a single view of ultimacy, and that the best we can do is to aim for consonance relations. So here you are in your tradition with your beliefs. Here's what science has to say. Compare, contrast, you know, enjoy the hum of harmony or the the clash of dissonance. And if there's dissonance, think about it a little bit. That's what the goal is, right? It's the science-religion equivalent of confessional theology, because you're working from a particular tradition. Very, very powerful for people in those traditions, because, of course, you're dealing with their primary concern. But when your social location is the secular academy, as mine is, as working as a religious philosopher, you've got a different set of questions. You're not primarily concerned about the survival of another institution. You're interested in the secular academy's survival and its functioning. And so you've got a different set of priorities as a result. Well, here's the other type of question. If it can't help us pick out a single giraffe God, maybe it can help us choose among competing theories of ultimacy. And here we are, this time it's a forest with mist, that each tree might represent a view of ultimate reality. This is what I think is more likely to be a meaningful contribution of natural theology. It won't even be able to tell you what the best or tallest tree is. It's just going to be able to sort out the plausibility of various claims about ultimate reality, sort them relative to stateable criteria that can be made explicit so that they can be subjected to correction. All right, so time to get into the logic. Comparative natural theology seeks to compare numerous compelling accounts of ultimacy in as many different respects as might be relevant, thereby assembling the raw materials for an inference to best explanation argument on behalf of particular theories of ultimacy. So you've got 10 different theories of ultimacy. Which one's the best? That's an inference to best explanation. What's being explained? Nature. What's explaining? Theories of ultimacy. To figure out this in detail, we need to think about an ontology of nature. An ontology of nature is enormously complex logically. At the simplest and most idealised level, if O is an ontology of nature, it's a finite conjunction, say, of n propositions, usually philosophically voiced propositions inspired by the sciences. Each establishes some philosophically basic concepts for making sense of natural objects and processes. So you might see the laws of nature in there, for example. Or you might see probabilistic tendencies that happen in natural regularities. You might see an account of causation, or you might see the meaning of energy stated, or something like that. So an ontology of nature would include those things. Now, in practice, it's going to be complicated because these propositions collectively may not be mutually consistent. And I gave you before an example, causation, where in fact you've got different parts of science using inconsistent understandings of causation. Another complication, the conjunction in any given formulation doesn't exhaust everything that's relevant to an ontology of nature, so you could have an incompleteness problem. Third, the collection of propositions is a snapshot of a dynamic process. In real life, the ontology is constantly adjusting to the growing insights in the sciences. It's not just static. Scientific theories themselves are enormously complicated. They are snapshots of dynamic research programs with complex internal structures. and very complicated relations to data. So this is the realistic picture of the internal structure and ontology of nature, and it's utterly neglected in traditional natural theology. If you work from the most superficial characterization of an ontology of nature as a finite conjunction of consistent propositions, so we're going to ignore the fact that we've got inconsistency, you'll get yourself assumption 1 up there. Right? A finite conjunction of consistent philosophical propositions about nature. And if you've got assumption 2 in play, all propositions about ultimacy are consistent because there's only one reality. How could there be any big fights? Yes, that assumption is frequently made in natural theology, and surfacing it might make you feel uncomfortable if you've done natural theology in the past, but that assumption is really there. So let's understand the logic. Suppose O3 describes the closed causal nexus of nature. That would essentially mean no miracles or something. O9 describes instances of specified complexity. There are 2 bits of the ontology of nature. And suppose our 2 competing ultimacy theories are these. U1 is a first cause exists and we call it God. U2 is an intelligent designer exists and we call it God. Traditional natural theology tries to go from O3, the closed causal nexus of nature, to U1, a first cause exists and we call it God. You will recognise that. Anyone? Where have you heard that? You'll see that in South Asia as well, but you Westerners will know where that comes from. Augustine first, Thomas Aquinas is one of his 5 ways. And also, natural theology will try to go from an instance of specified complexity that science supposedly can't explain to an intelligent designer. That's from O9 to U2. What direction are those arrows running in? From the ontology of nature to ultimacy. Right? Just like the big arrow we saw right at the start of the talk. Well, now, invoke assumption 1. That means that you're going from not just O3, but O, an ontology of nature. It's harmonious. There's no problem there. From O to U1 or from O to U2. Invoke assumption 2. That means you're just going from O to U because you don't need to worry about competing or contradictory ultimacy theories. So you're going directly from an ontology of nature to an ultimacy theory. And you've made 1,000 mistakes along the way. Demonstrable logical mistakes. I'll be really clear about what's really going on next. But this is what traditional natural theology does. And it's no wonder it's fallen into such disrepute. Everyone has become sensitive to these errors. So what comparative theology does, let's take 3 hypotheses about ultimacy. Now forget what they are for now, just channel a mathematician for a moment. As you know, maybe some of you, I was trained as a mathematician, so I think mathematically this stuff feels to me like bread and butter after not eating for a long time. A cool glass of fresh, clear spring water after not drinking for a long time. But I know it's very confusing for other people. Just bear with me. The mathematicians will be feeling right at home. So now we've got 3 ultimacy hypotheses, UH, 1, 2 and 3. Suppose that the first ultimacy hypothesis entails 4 different propositions about an ontology of nature. Which way is the arrow running? It's the opposite direction, right? Because now we're looking for ultimacy to explain nature. So if UH1 was a personal omnibenevolent being as ultimate reality, O1 might be the conditions necessary for rationally intelligible cosmos, for example. You wouldn't expect to see in that list of parts of an ontology of nature something about the real story of evolution, because that does not look like a personal God made it. Thus, 50% of people in this country think that there must be something wrong with evolution because it contradicts their homey idea of a personal deity. And only 7% of biologists in the Natural Academy of Sciences say that they're personal theists because, once again, they see the conflict. There is a conflict, right? So UH1 does have entailments to some parts and not others of an ontology of nature. And the same will be true for UH2 and UH3. Right, so notice then that O1 is entailed by all three ultimacy hypotheses. Not very useful for discriminating them then, is it? Right, but look at O8. That's only there in the first one, and O6 is only there in the first one and the first two. So let's suppose there was some argument that comes from somewhere, not unlike the argument I told you about earlier, the comparative criteria that you have to solve the problem of the one and the many. Let's say you invoke that, or something like it. O6 is especially important. So if you don't produce O6 as you figure out what your inferences are from your ultimate reality hypothesis, then you're in trouble, man. You're in trouble. You've got to get O6. Who produces O6? UH1. So that's a check mark for UH1. But it's not over, because there could be a dozen different comparative criteria, maybe more, maybe many more. O8 is especially important, could be another one. Well, that would give a boost to UH1 and UH2 because they produce O6. I said that round the wrong way, my apologies. O6 is present in UH1 and UH2. So that gives both of them a boost simultaneously, but not UH3. O8 gives a boost to CC, the ultimacy hypothesis number one, but neither of the other two. Other way around. So what's the conclusion? That if O6 is the thing that really, really matters, then UH1 and UH2 are superior to UH3. If O8 is especially important, then UH1 is superior to U2 and U3. And if they were the only criteria that mattered, you'd conclude that ultimacy hypothesis 1 was winning, ultimacy hypothesis 3 was losing, and ultimacy hypothesis 2 was somewhere in between. Now what have we done? We've surfaced what people really need to fight over. What do they need to fight over? The comparative criteria. Now they're out in the open. Instead of operating surreptitiously, comparative natural theology forces them out into the open, where people now have to take responsibility for them. They have to argue the case about why a particular comparative criteria should matter and why another one should be subordinated. That's what's really going on in natural theology. It's just hidden. So this is what I mean. These last two slides explain what I mean when I say that traditional natural theology is a short-circuited version of something only properly described when you turn all the arrows around the other way and set it up as an inference to best explanation process. So what then? You've got lots of comparative criteria and they conflict, potentially. Maybe you can resolve that conflict if you just get yourself properly organised. Use the resources that you've got. Maybe you can resolve it. But maybe the sociality of inquiry is not developed enough to do it. We didn't used to have science, and now we do. We didn't used to have advanced medical treatments, but now we do. So something changed, right? It was the sociality, it was the organisation of human beings in the way they put their efforts together that changed, among other things. So maybe we need to reorganise the way we work together in groups. But maybe even if we do that, we still won't be able to resolve a conflict, and we'll be in this utterly non-decisive rational landscape. But then that's the best we can do. And what comparative natural theology delivers to you is a very powerful analysis of why you can't do better. And what traditional natural theology does is obscure the difficulties to the point that you remain deluded into thinking that you can do more when in fact you can't. Now, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how good natural theology can be, but I do know that you have to expose the relevant criteria to proper adjudication and debate. Otherwise, you're going to be making mistakes in your judgment about how good it can be. Now, traditional natural theology violates all of these considerations, which is very sad. It usually ignores alternative ultimacy hypotheses. It neglects making explicit comparative criteria, allowing them to function silently, unanalysed and unchallenged. It oversimplifies ontological premises and the scientific theories that inform them. It often treats ultimacy arguments as strictly analogous to arguments in other domains, failing to register the potentially rationality-defeating nature of inquiry into ultimacy. By contrast, the transparency of criteria for metaphysical superiority, which are the comparative criteria, in comparative natural theology is a huge advance. Transparency stimulates superior conversation across different views because clearly stated criteria can benefit from criticism in a way that covert criteria do not. So we're getting towards the end here. I'd like to talk for a little bit about modelling comparative judgments. I've just given you a logical analysis of inference to best explanation arguments. And in the process, we noticed a shift in direction of the arrows. What's really going on is that ultimacy hypotheses are implying things about ultimate reality, about ontology of nature, and you're looking at how well they cover the explanatory territory to decide how good they are. So you're trying to infer the best explanation from the types of coverage they give you of the natural world. How will they explain things? This is not the traditional account of inference to best explanation. The traditional account is a Bayesian probability approach. And so if you know anything about this literature, it's worthwhile visiting the Bayesian probability approach briefly, just so that you can see what the differences are. There's this thing called conditional probability. That's the probability of a proposition A given things B and C. A classic example would be down the bottom there. You've got a crime, you've got background facts about the world, you've got specific evidence related to the crime, and you've got two possible suspects. Those suspects are the hypotheses. What you want to do is figure out what the probability is that Jake did it versus the probability that Jill did it. And to do that, you want to calculate the conditional probability that Jake did it given the background facts and given the specific evidence of the crime. That's the task. So that's the Bayesian analysis of two competing hypotheses, and it's used in crime scene analysis all the time, and you will see the famous Sherlock Holmes invoking that when he says, after you've ruled out everything that's impossible, whatever's left has got to be the correct answer. Right? So it might not be highly probable, but it's a comparative competition that we're talking about here. We're evaluating maybe very low probability things against low probability things. Prior probability matters. That's the probability. Excuse me. The prior probability of an hypothesis E involves bracketing the evidence. So forget about the crime scene. Just think about what you know about people. Just regular people. A classic example, Jack committed the crime, if that's hypothesis 1, and Jill committed the crime, that's hypothesis 2. Maybe the prior probability is that that's a male crime, people. Men just do that one a lot more than women do. So prior probability might promote one of the hypotheses over another. So prior probability is high when the hypothesis has desirable intrinsic features such as simplicity or elegance, or it fits closely with background facts. Explanatory power, then, is the probability of the hypothesis given E the evidence and F the facts, the background facts. And the explanatory power is high when H has high predictive power. That is, evidence E is likely given the assumption of the hypothesis H and background facts F. Evidence E has low prior probability. That'll also push up the explanatory power of the hypothesis H. Think about it. If you've got all this evidence and it could have happened anyway, then it doesn't really tell you anything about how good the hypothesis is. But if this evidence can only be explained by the hypothesis, right, then you've got high explanatory power. All right, the last step in the Bayesian analysis of inference to best explanation is what happens when you get a tie. If the probability of the two hypotheses is the same, then you go with the one that has higher prior probability. Now that's the way it's normally done. Those of you who've done any logic or anything really related to statistics will have heard about this type of thing. It's not very complicated, but a little unfamiliar. What's different about it is that the easiest way to see what's different about it is to look at the way it's used. Richard Swinburne, a famous Christian philosopher, wrote his book, The Existence of God, a few years after he wrote a book on confirmation theory. And in his book on confirmation theory, he talked at length about the Bayesian analysis of explanatory power and inference to best explanation. Having defended that and articulated that, he wrote his book on the existence of God, in which he considered just two hypotheses. Theism, in his idiosyncratic understanding of that, that's defined in his book on the coherence of theism, and atheism, which he took to be the most flattened out, uninteresting version of atheism that you can imagine, none of the interesting kinds of atheism. These are the contrasts, and he used the Bayesian analysis to produce the conclusion there, that the probability of H1, given the evidence and the background facts, is greater than the probability of H2, given the evidence and the background facts. Thus, God exists. Now, that's not a knockdown proof, is it? This is a probabilistic proof. So that's an advance. And he at least was thinking in terms of inference to best explanation. So that's an advance. But his coverage of ultimacy theories is monumentally one-sided, particularly when you consider his unusual understanding of God as a temporal being. I don't know if you know his work, but you probably don't read Christian philosophy a lot around here, but if you did, you would discover that he gave up on the idea of an eternal God. He didn't think it was coherent to imagine that such a God could be providentially involved in the world. So he imagined that God has a temporal life and acts out of that temporal life. So, among other hypotheses that are missing is the classic, traditional, even Christian theistic view, which isn't even there, like Thomas's view. All right, so this and the other problems that I've mentioned just lead me to think that there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way. You can't continue on like this with this sort of oversimplified, pat yourself on the shoulder for coming up with an argument that really no one believes except people who are already inclined to believe it. I think we can do much better. So, recent philosophical attempts to make sense of inference to best explanation, or comparative judgments of similarity and difference, of consonance and dissonance, of elegance and coherence, have turned especially on the integration of cognitive science and philosophy. Cognitive modelling has proved to be a really important tool here. Valuational judgments of, yes, that's like this thing, or that's not like that, or that doesn't fit, or that does fit, those sorts of valuational judgments, they occur in our prodigiously complex brains. And our brains have special ways of detecting overall resonance between two sets of biologically coded information. Connectionist models of brain processes are especially useful because they represent hypotheses as distributed patterns of activation in the nodes of a connectionist machine. So you might have 1,000 nodes which are activated to different degrees. So an hypothesis isn't just a proposition, it's a distributed activation pattern, almost like a landscape, a three-dimensional landscape. That's what you're comparing, these three-dimensional landscapes, not simple propositions and their logical inferences. We're built for that. We've got brains that do that kind of thing. This is nothing less than a superb pattern recognition and pattern comparison machine. Now, you could abstract from that a Bayesian analysis if you wanted, put it in Bayesian terms of hypothesis comparison in the ways that we just looked at it. But it seems way, way too oversimplified given the way our brains are actually functioning when it comes to judgments of similarity and difference. So that's us. Pattern recognition machine up there. From start to finish. It's not just our brains, it's our immune systems as well. If you've ever studied immunology, you'll know that we've actually got astonishing chemical stuff that's brilliant for detecting patterns in the environment, for figuring out whether a particular invader is friendly or not, whether, well, if it's an invader, it's probably not friendly, whether something's an invader or a local protein, and you marshal resources depending on that. The signatures that you've got to analyse to pull that off, they're really complicated. And again, you need lots of things to happen on the surface of the important cell, not just in one little place. It's a distributed pattern that needs to happen in order to get the activation inside the cell up enough to release the things that are going to go and fight that particular protein or that virus or that invading cell. It's also in faces. Facial recognition is one of our brilliant things. We're very, very good at that. And that brings up an important issue, that we're vulnerable to serious errors of judgment, especially in pattern recognition. Our skills for pattern recognition appear to be overproductive hypotheses to explain the puzzles we come across. We just see faces. We're anthropomorphically inclined from beginning to end. We're seeing patterns. We're seeing meaning. Why do people keep buying lottery tickets, right? There's so much going on there that we're inclined to, because of these pattern recognition systems that we all are. That can be a problem, particularly when you get to asking yourself, does that ultimacy hypothesis feel the same or different than that one? That feeling of similarity has been profoundly, aggressively critiqued by a whole bunch of people, including especially Jonathan Z. Smith, who's pointed out that comparative theology is too often worked on the basis of people just feeling that things are similar. Well, if this is the way our minds work, it's pretty dangerous to just assume that your feeling about things being similar is reliable, because your brain is going to be overproductive of those types of intuitions. So you're going to need a different type of procedure. And the Comparative Religious Ideas project that I mentioned earlier produced a different type of procedure, in which hypotheses were used to express judgments of similarity and difference, and then they were scrutinised with a whole bunch of different experts and recrafted and reshaped and sometimes tossed and other times retained in a refined form. That's a social project, very complicated and fitting to the actual situation that you're dealing with in comparative natural theology. So in light of these complexities, without even touching on the peculiarities of ultimacy metaphysics, I think a Bayesian analysis of inference to best explanation is at best a pretty rough simplification or abstraction from a more complex process of judgment and inquiry. The alternative that I propose stresses awareness of many relevant hypotheses, transparency of the comparative criteria that guide the judgments of similarity and difference, dynamic complexity of both ontologies of nature and ultimacy theories, and the futility of stipulating a reliable recipe for defining the artful process of evaluating competing conceptual systems. This approach still doesn't come fully to terms with the precise way we make judgments of similarity and difference, of simplicity and fit. Obviously, it's going to be complicated. It's like if you're comparing landscape, it's not going to be simple, is it? It's not like comparing two numbers. But it has made that process responsive by building in the kinds of transparency and flexibility that facilitate correction of judgments in an ongoing process of adjustment and improvement. All right, let's wrap it up. So natural theology is always dependent on a complex kind of comparative argumentation, and I've talked about the logical and biological conditions for that this evening. Traditional natural theology aims at direct inference from nature to ultimacy only by mistake, a mistake of oversimplification that takes the form of unanalyzed and hidden propositions. Natural theology properly described, which is another way of saying comparative natural theology, involves surfacing criteria for judgment that operate silently, beneath the misleading surface of traditional natural theology. Comparative natural theology also involves acknowledging that many aspects of the judgments involved, especially those of consonance and dissonance, similarity and difference, are aesthetically complex, entangled in philosophical tastes and formative personal influences, influenced by cultural and traditional structures, and resistant to complete clarification. So what are we talking about? It's a non-decisive rational landscape. It's not irrational. It's not decisive. It's a non-decisive rational landscape. And this picture reminds me of a non-decisive rational landscape. You're really not too sure what's going on, but you've got a shot of getting from A to B. You might fall off, might slip, it might break. I don't know what that is. I can tell you it's in Iceland. But a non-decisive rational landscape, for me, has got the characteristics of journeying built into it. So what I'm arguing is that if we're in the business of making judgments of similarity and difference, if that's at the root of comparing ultimacy hypotheses, then inevitably we're involved in those strange currents of our own personal lives. The way we're formed, what we come to find plausible, or what we find ridiculous, or what we were taught to fear. All of those things are activated in those moments when we make those comparative judgments. So rather than saying it's all useless because of that, how about we try and get precise? How about we try and say, to the extent that we can, what criteria we're actually invoking? And maybe one of those criteria is, I'm really, really scared of that idea. I don't want to go there. Or I'm afraid I'm going to be angering my ancestors, so I don't want to discuss that one. Whatever they are, if they're actually functioning, why not get them out there for discussion? At least in the context of the secular academy, there shouldn't be any sacredness rules that prevent you from surfacing those kinds of considerations. They should all be stateable, they should all be discussable, they should all be debatable. And when we bring everything out into the open like that, we're actually doing, in comparative natural theology, what natural theology has been doing all along in every form, but just in an oversimplified and unsatisfactory way. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you for your attention this evening. Sure. Right.
Wesley, I really like your presentation. As a Roman Catholic, I don't want to take the side of a skeptic like Bob. And I thought, where you move beyond Swinburne with your own complexity at the end makes a lot of progress. Nevertheless, there is a little bit of discomfort that I have. And the discomfort that I have is whether religious questions involve more poetic language than, let us say, the cognitive language of natural theology, and that you want to complexify through new theories of inference. Suppose the question is more like, does love exist? Or what do we mean by love? Someone may read a sonnet of Shakespeare. Another person may read Dante. Another person may read Goethe. I made the mistake, actually. I almost didn't get married because I gave a poem of Goethe to my girlfriend, and she didn't like Goethe, that poem, but he managed to survive. You see, now, why do we go to poetry to talk about love? Because we might think, if someone came to me and said, oh, love is neurological fiber 117 is being stimulated. Or someone said, gee, whenever my girlfriend's name was mentioned in an MRI machine was on my head, a certain lobe of the area of my brain got very active. I would say the reason why I go to poetry is because there's something in the imagination that cannot be cognitively reduced. Now, I'm a little bit afraid of that because that can sound like a kind of irrationalism in comparison to the kind of cognitive inference that you want to develop. Nevertheless, there is so much imaginative literature. There is so much poetry in the world because they're attempting to get at dimensions of human existence and life where they ask ultimate questions like love. And then they feel the more natural theological inferential approach is inadequate to the dimension of that experience. How would you respond to that?
Well, this is an old fight with us.
Right.
And it's surprising, you may be surprised to learn that I'm actually on Frank's side, but he doesn't realise it. I mean, I've spent many pages and bottles of ink fighting against reductionism of the kind that eliminates the complexity that's proper to a phenomenon. So for me, the trick is to start with phenomenology if you want to do a full story and get the full complexity of whatever it is you're worried about on the table. Once it's on the table, it stands as a test of how good the explanation you got was. And if what you got was, you know, neuron 117 firing, I can barely even say those words, it sounds so stupid. But I think that's what you said, right? Yeah. If that's what you got, then, you know, fail. Right? You never got to grips with what really mattered about the phenomenon in question. Right. On the other hand, if the prediction was that you never will say anything neurologically relevant to love, then that's to me head in the sand stuff. And so, as you know, my stance is that there's absolutely no reason to worry about non-reductive scientific explanations of things. Reductionism in the sciences or in understandings of inference happens. It's a social phenomenon when it happens. It's a philosophical reading of the sciences when it happens. And it's a philosophy that needs to be contested, right? So, how many people actually worry about analysis of inference to best explanation arguments? Well, not even everyone in this room. Despite the fact that you are here this evening, some of you probably won't make this your life's work, right? So the number of people who handle complexities related to comparison, ultimate reality and so forth is tiny. Most of us are dealing with life in a different way, and thank God for that. What I've discovered, and what I think I can recommend to other people, is that if you're so inclined, you don't need to choose. So it's a restatement of my side of an old argument, but I hope you understand why I say that I'm on his side and he just doesn't get it.
But do you want to answer the poetry part?
Oh, well, I'm into it. I think the reason he likes poetry isn't because of some fancy philosophical something about poetry. It's because it works. Poetry seduces. Come on, Frank. Poetry seduces. That's why you like it.
Reasoning seduces also.
Oh, it can. Fair enough. Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, thanks very much. This was really fascinating. I was originally going to ask this question as a South Asianist, so here's a tradition. But then your own talk, when you started with embodied cognition, raised the same issue for me, because even your last, that lovely image from Iceland, was straight. Didn't have an arrow, but it was straight. And I'm wondering what, when you try to get at the complexity, there are certainly limits to that value of inference. And I'm wondering, by the end of your talk, what are the limits of any kind of rational discourse we would call philosophy?
Right.
Because they have to be there, and you have to butt up against them at some level in a project like this. And that's another way of asking Francis's question.
Yep.
So it was the one thing that you didn't trouble until about 6:10, when the arrows disappeared, was that you could change the direction, but the arrow itself wasn't complexified at all. So I'm wondering, do you see this as a complexification of inferential or reasoning of any sort itself? What happens to the philosophical project of natural theology in this?
Yeah. In one of the books you mentioned, I develop a theory of inquiry.
Yes. I thought you'd talk about that.
In order to drive home the point that inference itself is as complicated as bodies, and as complicated as bodies that are embodied and socially located. So you cannot have inference without traditions, and you cannot have inference without minds. very
and
complicated.
as a South Asianist, I want to ask, could you even draw inference in favor of something else?
You could. You wouldn't be talking about recognisably natural theology. I don't think I talk about inference explicitly at all, really, in the book on theory of inquiry. This is an application of a theory of inquiry to a special issue where everything is about the arrow. The natural theology is all about the arrow. Now, how would you discover the limits of the philosophical reasoning approach? My argument, as a pragmatist and in my experience, is that you have to encounter those limits. And that when you do encounter those limits, it's not clear that you've encountered a definitive limit, because it may be a problem with the social organisation of inquiry that you're dealing with. And that if you do what Cripp did, put the right kinds of experts in the room, you can go a whole bunch further than you thought you could before. Right? So that's what it means to take sociality of inquiry seriously. Right? Embodiment of inquiry is the thing I mainly talked about, embodied cognition and whatnot. But sociality of inquiry is just as important, and not just in those weird ways that we're conditioned by our traditions to prefer certain things and not others, but also in the way inquiry itself is more or less efficient. The answer to have you encountered limits in the philosophical project in general is yes, but I don't know how strict they are, because it requires organising and reorganising and rethinking. So for me, everything's pretty much an open question on that point precisely. And I think there's a whole bunch of South Asianists, maybe Shankara are leading among them, who'd be with me on that, right? Wouldn't Shankara wouldn't he leave the question of the precision or capabilities of reason somewhat open, because the ultimate reality itself breaks cognition?
Well, there's a real limit to that rationality. You go so far through this process of agreement and difference, and then essentially he says there's a leap of faith to get to ultimacy. I was thinking much more of the Kashmir Shaiva tradition, wherein they're probably the philosophical tradition that most values the natural world as indicative of ultimacy. So no Maya, no illusion, none of that. And yet they very quickly, in literary theory, ritual treatise, philosophical treatise, dismiss anumana or inference because it's so limited, and instead develop this doctrine of what's known as translated as recognition. And they have a theory of language and the suggestive power of both language and phenomenal existence to get there. And it's explicitly not inference for them. So I was starting to think about how could you philosophically account for the play of models, partial models of natural.
I think they're intuiting the phenomena correctly. They're seeing what we're actually doing in judgments or in inferences is comparing landscapes. And so
they reject that out of hand.
Would they?
That recognition is explicitly said not to be that. So.
Well, that's what recognition, the word recognition in this context would mean exactly that.
Right.
And because you can't codify it completely. It's you can penetrate it rationally. You can say a few things about it, but in the end, what you're doing is analysing something that operates fairly instinctively on a biological basis that doesn't lend itself to exhaustive analysis in proposition.
You had that slide where you had different ontologies of nature and certain features implying a different model of, or rather inferring a different model of ultimacy based on a certain key feature. You didn't really give examples, so I was wondering if I could throw in a couple of examples. Maybe you could help clarify them. So I'm thinking of things like, the cosmological argument really takes off on this certain theory of per se causation, and then the Kalam cosmological argument seems to be based on the idea of the universe is not past infinite, or the design argument based on fine-tuning. Are those examples of those propositions, of conjoined propositions that lead to particular? So, for example, I thought that a per se theory of causation would lead you to like the God that Aquinas sort of concludes with. But like the past finite universe, if that's the only thing you're working on, won't get you all the way. Or like you may conclude that there's a designer, but the designer is like a being like parallel to the world.
Right.
And then is that what you meant?
Yeah.
And how do you pick like which one is more like what's the proper way? Like, would you be honest and say, well, okay, here are like 3 different things, 3 different features, but I get 3 models at the end. Like, do I say I don't know which one, or do I find out what's in common of all 3 ultimacy models?
It's that complicated. Let's take Thomas as an example. So Thomas had Aristotle to draw on. Aristotle thought the universe was an infinite being, had an infinite past. And this meant, for Aristotle, it meant that he did not need to posit anything like ontological dependence, ultimately, of the universe on a creator. The universe, for Aristotle, was self-caused, self-maintaining, and so forth. Thomas enters the picture and fights with that idea, but his fundamental way of fighting with it is to fight with it on the level of ontological dependence. He says, even if you've got an infinite run of secondary causes in Aristotelian terms, there still has to be a fundamental cause beneath all of it, not a temporal cause necessarily. It could be an eternal first cause, right? So you still have to have ontological dependence. In the comparative natural theology way of rendering that, you would say that Thomas's idea of God implies that you must have an item in an ontology of nature, that ontological dependence must be real and demands an explanation. Right? Whereas Aristotle's understanding of ultimate reality implies the opposite. You set it up that way. Now, you could do your science work as much as you want. You'd still never settle the question about whether the universe actually is ontologically dependent on something transcendent or subscendent, right? You never settle that. That's why it's a philosophical issue, and the way the question gets sorted then is with comparative criteria. So some people will say one comparative criteria is that you need to solve the problem of the one and the many. I mentioned that earlier, right? If that's the criteria that you emphasise, Thomas wins because he's got an integrated, unified understanding of the one that explains the many. Whereas Aristotle has just the universe duplicating itself as the explanation of the one that explains the many. And at least on the way that comparative criterion would normally be understood, that would make Thomas the winner. So that's the breakdown. Now, in the end, I've written things like this. I have exactly the problem you described. So I'm working with 3 major ultimacy hypotheses. I've got 20 different considerations related to ontology of nature, and I tease out of the issue 24 comparative criteria. And the 24 comparative criteria then have to be weighed and argued and sorted and balanced so that you distribute plausibility across the 3 ultimacy hypotheses in the way that's required. That's as complicated as it is. There is no simpler version. That any simpler version just masks the complexity. So that there's no shortcut. And I think what we need to do is just fess up and say it really is that complicated. But that doesn't mean you can't do anything. Yeah. Tim.
Is the nature of the academy, either in terms of its contingent culture or its necessary character, such that some of its criteria for comparison can't, or at least won't, ever be called into question?
Do we mean in practice or in principle?
In practice.
Yes. There are lots of criteria for comparison that are not called into question in a secular academy. A classic one would be you absolutely have to take your bearings from revealed theology, otherwise you're never going to know anything about ultimate reality. Right? So if you've got an ultimacy hypothesis that supports that benefits from that ultimacy hypothesis is going to be better. Well, that is ruled out in the secular academy, and ruled out for a reason. It's a part of the distinctive character of the sociality of the secular academy. So you could pay a price for that, and the price might be there's just a whole bunch of stuff you're never going to find out that's true. Okay, but that's a price that the whole academy is built around accepting. The problem is people aren't very open about it in the way I was just then, sort of frankly acknowledging that if Karl Barth's right, then the secular academy is missing something. Right? So that's a good question. Yeah. Yep.
You mentioned Charles Hartshorne in your talk, and he did a pretty extensive ultimacy model comparison.
He did.
And I think he primarily used inclusivity as his comparative criteria, but you seem to feel he fell short even in that approach, and maybe again taking too simplistic an approach and absorbing all the different ultimacies into, going from theism to pantheism to panentheism. How do you feel like that fell short in this?
Well, I wasn't evaluating his analysis of God models or ultimacy models, which is a very interesting and thoughtful piece of work, actually. I wish everyone doing natural theology would read that book, just have their brains exploded and get the range of models that they should be worrying about out into the open, so that when they make their choices they realise they're choosing among, not just choosing the obvious, right? So I love that piece of work. But the criterion that he depends on, inclusiveness, is one of, I think, a dozen criteria that he should be worried about that are equally primordial, sort of rationally and experientially. To emphasise inclusiveness, interestingly enough, he has to de-emphasise the one I mentioned before, the solution to the problem of the one and the many. He de-emphasises that, interestingly enough, without a lot of argument. But he does de-emphasise it. Well, why? What's the preference that lies behind emphasising inclusiveness but de-emphasising the solution of the problem of the one and the many? Whitehead, that Hudson was bouncing off of Whitehead did exactly the same thing. Whitehead said, I'm going to rename the problem of the one and the many to mean this other thing, that is a processive idea, the many bubble along and they become one. So it's a yielding to oneness that's built into the process of things. Well, why reject the traditional South Asian and West Asian understanding of the problem of the one and the many that way? I think what you're doing is expressing an opinion about what you think is important, and I think that opinion should be stated in a comparative criteria and subject to debate. And that's what I think Hartshorne doesn't do well enough. Does that help? Yep.
Yes, I heard you right in an offhand remark. You defined yourself as a mystical theologian.
Oh, yes, I did.
I wonder if you'd say a couple words about that and draw some lines of connection between that and today's enterprise.
Well, yes, in a nutshell, if comparative theology worked out as well as it possibly could, you found out everything you could possibly find out, in my view what you would have is the best model or the best approximation for something that necessarily breaks cognition. All you would have is the best model, the best approximation. The thing that breaks comprehension, this is the ultimate reality for me. That's the thing I'm oriented to as a philosopher and a theologian. That thing looks a lot more like Nirguna Brahman or a ground of being religious naturalist type model for that, I think is superior than a personal theistic model. But I think both of those are approximations to something that in its cognitive and ontological richness defeats comprehension. That's an hypothesis. The fact that it's an hypothesis, the fact that it's that hypothesis defines what it means for me to be an apophatic mystical theologian. But I wasn't talking about that at all. just so you know. Yeah, was that a hand, Dave?
Yeah.
Cool.
So a little bit off the side, a little bit related to the poetry question. Hopefully, So you've laid out a picture here of how to develop really complicated philosophical analysis to make explicit the criteria we're using to try to assess these different types of natural theology.
Which I'm claiming is actually really, really simple. Yeah.
Doesn't sound that simple. Which, I mean, I think it's wonderful. One question I have is natural theology, as I think of it often, and this relates to the mysticism as well, what role does a sort of aesthetic contemplation of direct phenomenological aesthetic contemplation of aspects of nature, beautiful aspects of nature, horrifying aspects of nature, this sort of direct contemplation, is this just a totally separate route? I mean, obviously you wouldn't write a paper in a philosophical journal and say, I had this experience. And, but I'm curious, is this just a totally separate track? It seems fundamental to natural theology.
It is, and I don't think it's separate.
Okay.
Let's go back to having a target for analysis, whatever it is as a philosopher. You have to know what it is you're talking about. The best tool we've got for tying down a description of something to talk about is phenomenology in the most general sense. An attempt at impartial description of something in all of its richness, in all of the different levels of being and complexity. Well, that's where that stuff comes in. Like, when I think about love, I'm thinking of it in the same way that Frank does. And I want that to be there, but I'm not thinking about only in that way. I've also got the neurology of love echoing through so I'm trying to get that in there. I'm trying to get the social construction of love concepts and love practices in there as well. And I'm trying to get historical change of love. And I'm trying to imagine how love was different for our predecessor species as well. I mean, so all of that at once, why not? What am I doing? Part of what I'm doing is meditating on all of these different forms of wisdom that are available, some of which I get directly from experience. But I wouldn't want my account of love or anything else to be based solely on my experience. I wouldn't want to pretend that my understanding of love as I actually experience is going to give me the trick. That would be incredibly self-deceptive, right? So I can't leave it at that, but I can't do without that, or I'll never register the depth dimensions of the stuff that we're talking about. Just walked past Memorial Chapel earlier today, 4 times, and thought warmly of Paul Tillich and how much he would want to say how vital it is to register the depth dimension of anything it is that you happen to be talking about, and that's what that gives you. And without it, you just don't get it, and you wind up possibly committing the great, what I'm calling a cultural sin, of invidious reductionism. David.
Wesley, thanks very much. I missed the opening slides. I'm not sure I got where the arrows were pointing or if I was even on the right planet with the arrows. But I was intrigued by your ending with the neuroscience and the idea of a kind of complexification of a kind of a landscape rather than propositions that can be done in a very kind of mathematical sense. And I suppose what I was interested in is, as you've seen the early growth of neuroscience and what's coming out of it, you know, this is a hopeless question in a way, but what do you think might be the future possibilities of neuroscientific understanding for natural theologians? Just etched out of it. I know it, you know, we can't know what's going to happen in 20 years' time, but on the basis of what you see and what you think is a reasonable extrapolation of where you think it's going.
I know historians think that you can't know what's going to happen in 20 years' time, but I'm writing a book on the future of spirituality at the moment, and I'm predicting exactly what's going to happen in 20 years' time, all things being equal. So.
I guess we were on different sides of the corridor.
Yeah. But I've got computer models in mind. You don't have computer models in your historical analysis. So, neuroscience most naturally impacts your understanding of the human person. So the first place that neuroscience hits is in theological anthropology or religious anthropology. What kind of beings are we? What does it mean to connect together in groups? What does it mean to communicate? How does ritual work? Neuroscience is impacting all of those things. What are religious symbols? How do we process religious symbols? Why are religious experiences the way they are? Are they cognitively reliable? You know, all of those things as well. Now, that is about the human condition, the human person in society. That's just the first stop, though. Your question really is about, can you bend that to natural theological interests and wind up inferring something stably about ultimate reality? And I think there are ways of doing that, but it's really complicated, and once again, it's philosophically mediated. So you don't go anywhere. You can take as many photographs of people experiencing brain states special brain states in an fMRI machine or a SPECT machine or something as you like, and it's never going to have any traction on things to do with God. But if you do get a handle on the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences, in which process I've argued in another book that the neurosciences can play a role indirectly, then the neurosciences are playing a role in something that affects the reliability of information that would play a role in natural theological types of arguments. The argument from religious experience is a really big argument. It's the argument that Swinburne uses to clinch the case in favour of theism over against atheism. Right? So it does a lot of work, and not just for him, it does a lot of work for other people. I think it's possible for neuroscience directly to undermine the saliency of that move in the argument he makes, thereby undermining the clincher that he uses to promote his favourite hypothesis, for instance. So that's a concrete example of how neuroscience very indirectly, through 3 different steps, all philosophically mediated, impacts natural theology. There are people who say you could get direct connections from neuroscience to understandings of God or something, but I think those people need to go and take an undergraduate class in philosophy. It's not happening. Not in 20 years' time, not in 2,000 years' time. That's not happening.
Do you mind if I ask another one?
No, there's no other hands. So.
Okay, I can't see back there. So what David's question asked, and you put science might help on this sort of partial ontology of nature, but my field generates all of this popular literature, like, the Tao of physics and things like that, which are attempts, at least in popular imagination, at ultimacy arguments, right? They're mathematical, they're theoretical, and whether we're talking about chaos theory or string theory or braid theory or any of those things, do you see that having any potential impact on either the partial ontology of nature or the ultimacy argument?
Yes. Now, that's not neuroscience, right?
Yeah, no, it's not. It's a completely different wing of the sciences.
Philosophical cosmology has got a lot more power to directly impact ultimacy hypotheses than the neurosciences do. The book I was writing on before the sabbatical began is Science and Ultimate Reality. So it's a comparative theological argument, natural theological argument of exactly this kind, in which all of the contemporary sort of large-scale fundamental biological and physical considerations are taken into account and evaluated for their ability to shift plausibility that you might want to attach to 3 competing ultimacy hypotheses. And they cast their plausibility votes in a lot of different directions. Like fine-tuning, for example, that goes the main vote goes straight to personal theism. I mean, you've got a knob dialer sitting behind fine-tuning. That's as clear as day. So people who hold my view bet that fine-tuning is actually a passing phase, and that we're going to back multiverse theories, where you don't need to worry about the fine-tuning problem. So the ultimacy theory predicts something about an ontology, and you do your physics and figure out which part of the ontology is correct. But you see how the arrow runs? Yeah. Right? And so, yes, there's a lot more that can happen there. I think there's actually an answer to that question, in fact. The three views I'm looking at are all models of what I take to be ultimate reality. Obviously, you can't talk about ultimate reality in my strict sense, but with regard to the models, there's Whitehead's sort of process model, creativity itself, essentially, model. There's personal theism, and there's a ground of being, religious naturalism type view. And of those three views, I think doing this comparative process, you can show that the ground of being view is stronger than the other two. Not in a knockdown way, because again, we're not talking about knockdown arguments. And even as you make that conclusion, all of the comparative criteria are stated there and out in the open, so people would know exactly how to fight with me. No tricky hiding of presuppositions. Yeah, I think it's a lot more you can do there. Yeah.
This question follows up on what you were saying. So when you said that,
just speak a little louder.
Sorry, my question follows up on
Yep.
what you were just saying. So when you talk about religious naturalism and ground of being, what exactly? Like, do you use the term ground of being in the same way as like Paul Tillich?
Yes.
Or I know Paul Tillich wanted to clarify that his notion of ground of being is beyond supernaturalism and naturalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure what you mean when you call it religious naturalism, or is it?
It's a great question. Thank you. Again, we're not talking about my view of ultimate reality, but we're talking about my favourite model. If I were cast into a deep well and forced to shout out the models of ultimate reality that I would dispense with on the way down, and leave until very, very last the thing that I was most deeply committed to conceptually before falling to my death at the chasm floor, it would be ground of being theism. My argument about ground of being theism is that it is religious naturalism. You're correct that Tillich said he didn't want to use the word naturalism for that. But the way he was understanding naturalism, his objection to it was that it did not allow for registering the depth structures of reality. But if Tillich knew the way religious naturalism had developed in the last 50, 60 years, he would not have been concerned about registering the depth structures of nature. And he probably would have, I argue anyway, embraced the term naturalism in his traditionally cautious and ambiguous way. Right? So I've written things arguing that Tillich, when understood in the light of subsequent developments, offers a form of ground of being theism that is consistent with a form of religious naturalism. Right? And again, I don't say this is ultimate reality, just our best and last gasp.
Is that related at all to like what they call panentheism today, or is that something completely?
Panentheism is a very vague tent, big tent, right? A lot of things going on in there. Hartshorne's in there, Whitehead's in there, Phil Clayton is in there, Arthur Peacock's in there. There's a whole bunch of people living in that tent, and they pretty much all mean different things. So it's not one thing, panentheism, that's for sure. But in the traditional, either Whiteheadian or Hartshornian process theology line, living inside that tent, panentheism means that God is a process, that is an element of a wider reality. There is no creation, ex nihilo or otherwise. The universe just is the way it is. God doesn't make anything. God's not the thing on which everything is ontologically dependent. God is, as a special value maximising role to perform in the cosmos. And that cosmic function is what God does. Now, Whitehead and Hartshorne are slightly different. Hartshorne with a slightly more personalist understanding of how that works. Whitehead's much more sort of organismic, it's much more reflexive and automatic, but still they're both headed down that path. Now, neither of those understandings of God is a theory of ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is the whole shebang. God's just one part of it. So you couldn't relate ground of being theism to the God of process metaphysics. But you could relate ground of being theism to the whole story, creativity itself and the world and God in their co-determining process. You could do it that way. In that case, you've got two gods. You've got the little God of process, and you've got the big God that is the whole possibly incoherent collection of entities. So two gods, not one, and that's how you wind up resolving the ambiguity there. Right?
I just want to make a short comment to your answer to David, because maybe I might be a little more optimistic about neuroscience.
Right.
If you get away from trying to prove something, I mean, there are a lot of questions. What exactly is religious different from other elements? Are there specifically religious aspects of the brain? Why are some people more religious than other people? So it seems to be, well, we'll never have probative in terms of proving something. It could help us map out where exactly the religion fits in within our cognitive dimension. And that would be interesting. Now, obviously, they'll probably debate it. You know.
No, I think you're right, Frank. But my Science and Religious Anthropology book tries to spell all of that out. That's why I say neuroscience hits on religious anthropology first, and only very, very indirectly and by strange back paths does it affect ultimate reality hypotheses. But with regard to understanding the human condition, it is really, really powerful. And so no argument there. I think that's spot on.
I invite all of you to continue the conversation with Professor Wildman more informally. We have a reception laid out for you in a conference room. If you come down the hall the way you came in, it's the room at the front of the building. We've got wine, cheese, drinks, appetizers. But before you do that, please join me in thanking Professor Wildman.